She felt the child move on the morning they came to take her crown. It was a small thing, a flutter, low and insistent, like a fish turning beneath still water. Vara pressed one hand flat against her abdomen and stood at the window of the high tower, looking out at the fleet. 40 warships. The Velthari Dominion did not believe in gestures of subtlety. They believed in weight, in iron, in numbers so overwhelming that the losing side might be forgiven for thinking surrender was simply physics. She had been awake since the first signal fire appeared on the horizon, 3 hours before the twin moons set. She had not cried. She had not called for her generals. She had stood at the window and counted the lights moving across the dark water, and she had thought about Ren. Ren, who was 6 weeks dead. Ren, who had pressed his forehead to hers on the morning of the last great battle and said, in that quiet voice he used when he was most afraid, "Whatever happens out there, the child still comes. The child still matters." He had smelled of salt and iron. She had not let herself cry then either. 6 weeks was not long enough to understand that someone was gone. 6 weeks was just long enough to stop reaching for them in the dark and finding only cold sheets, to stop turning at a particular sound because that was the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor, and the adjustment, the small, brutal correction of expectation against reality, still happened every time. The grief was not a weight, not the way people described it. It was more like a room she lived in. She did not carry it. She simply inhabited it, moved through it, arranged her days around the shape of it the way you arrange furniture around a support column that cannot be removed. She was very good at inhabiting rooms she had not chosen. She was a queen. She had been doing it her entire adult life. The door to the tower room opened. Sira, her first sword, entered without knocking. That alone told Vara everything about how the morning was going. "They've sent a herald," Sira said. Her jaw was tight. She was a tall woman, older than Vara by a decade, with close-cropped gray hair and the flat eyes of someone who had been calculating odds her entire life and rarely liked the results. "He's waiting at the outer gate." "What terms?" "Surrender, abdication, and exile. The child when born to be raised at Velthari court." A pause. "As a ward." Vara turned from the window. "A ward." That was the word he used. The word they used when they meant hostage. When they meant the child would grow up eating Dominion food and speaking Dominion prayers and forgetting, year by year, the sound of her own language. Vara had been 8 years old when her own mother had explained to her what a ward was. She had not understood then. She understood now. "How long do they give us?" "Until midday." Vara looked down at her hand, still resting against the swell of her abdomen. 5 months along. Still small enough to hide beneath the right cut of armor, though she had stopped trying to hide it a month ago. Her people knew. The soldiers knew. Ren had announced it at the harvest gathering with a pride so naked and unguarded that half the room had laughed not at him, but with him, the way people laugh when they see something that is too genuinely good to be anything but real. She had been furious with him for that, too public, too exposed. She was not furious with him now. She would have given everything she had left to have him standing beside her so she could be furious with him again. She thought about what it meant to be furious with someone. You had to believe they were going to be there long enough for the argument to resolve. You had to believe there was a next conversation. Fury required faith in continuity, in the persistence of the person on the receiving end of it. She had not understood that until he was gone and the fury had nowhere to go, and she had stood in the cold of the funeral yard with the taste of grief in her mouth and thought, "I was angry at him because I believed absolutely that he would survive everything. I was angry at him the way you are angry at something permanent." She was 5 months pregnant, alone, and 40 warships were anchored off her coast. She thought he would have had a plan by now. She thought he would have also been terrified, and he would have hidden it very poorly, and she would have been the one standing steady while he worked through his fear out loud, and somehow the combination would have produced something workable. She thought, I have to be both of us now. Bring me my armor, she said. Sira did not move. Vara. You heard me. You're 5 months. I know exactly how many months I am. Her voice was even, not cold. She had never been a cold person, however much the Dominion's courtiers liked to describe her that way in their reports. Just steady. It was the thing Ren had claimed to love most about her, that she could be absolutely terrified and still sound like the floor of a forest. I'm not riding out to meet them in a nightgown. Bring me my armor. Sira held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and left. Vara looked back at the fleet. 40 ships, maybe 8,000 soldiers if they'd packed the holds tight. Her garrison, what was left of it after the disaster at the Keth River 3 weeks ago, numbered 400. The outer settlements might raise another 1,000, given time and messengers. She had neither. She also had, in the deep vaults beneath the citadel, something the Dominion did not know about. Something Ren had spent the last 4 years of his life building, quietly, in the spaces between wars. She placed both hands on the windowsill and thought about it. The Velthari Dominion had conquered 14 kingdoms in 60 years. They were very, very good at overwhelming force. They were less good. She had observed this carefully over the course of the long border negotiations that had preceded the most recent war, at the unexpected. They expected surrender or open battle. Those were the 2 modes they'd trained for, the 2 responses they had optimized against. They had not trained for what she was considering. She was still standing at the window when Sira returned with the armor, and the thought had solidified into something she could almost call a plan. It was not a good plan. It was, in fact, arguably a terrible plan. But it was the only plan that had any chance of working, and Vara had long ago made her peace with the difference between a good plan and the only plan available. She let Sira help her into the breastplate, the arm guards the greaves. The armor had been fitted before the pregnancy, and the breastplate sat differently now, a slight awkwardness across the chest, an adjustment she'd had the armorer make in the 4th month. It held. It would hold. Send word to Commandant Ose, she said, while Sira buckled the last strap. Tell him to have the deep vault teams ready, not armed yet, ready. And the herald. Tell him I'll receive him in the Great Hall in 1 hour. She picked up her helmet full-faced, with the Orc Queen's crests of hammered bronze that Ren had commissioned as a wedding gift, and turned it in her hands. Tell him I require the full protocol. Let him wait in the entry courtyard, in the sun. Sira allowed herself, just barely, the ghost of a smile. As you say. The great hall of Vara's citadel had been built by her grandfather, who had been a practical man with a flair for intimidation. The ceiling vaulted 40 feet above the stone floor. The walls held the banners of every clan who had sworn to the crown across 6 generations. There were 700 candles burning at any given hour, not because anyone needed the light, but because her grandfather had believed in the psychological weight of flame. The Dominion Herald was a young man, barely 20, by the look of him, which told Vara that the admiral commanding the fleet had sent a junior officer precisely because he expected the negotiation to be brief. The young man had the kind of posture that came from being raised to believe he represented an inevitable force. He stood in the center of the great hall with his scroll of terms and his polished armor and his expression of carefully rehearsed gravity, and Vara let him stand there for a full 2 minutes after she entered before she sat. She sat on the throne, the carved stone chair her grandmother had commissioned, with the sea creature reliefs along the arms that their people still argued about, because half of them thought it depicted the old ones with respect, and the other half thought it depicted them as defeated. She sat and she looked at the herald and she did not speak. The herald, to his credit, waited. You have terms, she said, finally. Her voice carried in the high stone room without effort. She did not project, she simply spoke and the room did the work. I do, Majesty. He unrolled the scroll. He read them. They were exactly what Sira had summarized: surrender, abdication, exile, the child as ward. He read them in the flat official tone of someone who'd been trained to read them in exactly that way, conveying neither malice nor regret but a kind of bureaucratic inevitability, as if the terms were simply the correct answer to an arithmetic problem. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" she asked. He blinked. It was not the question he'd been prepared for. 22, Majesty. "Were you at the Keth River?" A hesitation. "No." "Were any of the fleet commanders at the Keth River?" "Admiral Sorvath commanded." "Sorvath was at the Southern Reach 6 years ago." "The Keth River was Commandant Dreven's operation. She watched him. Dreven is dead. Did you know that?" The herald's composure flickered, barely. "I was informed that the battle—" "He died very quickly," Vara said. "The Keth River, for those who weren't there, had a particular feature that our border maps apparently failed to convey to your war council. There is a thermal vent system beneath the eastern bank. Wren discovered it 4 years ago." She paused. She let herself say his name without any particular emphasis, without letting it become a weight. Just a name. A man who had found a thermal vent and understood what it might be useful for. We used it. It was not a fair fight. But then, your fleet arriving here with 8,000 soldiers against 400 is not a particularly fair fight either. So perhaps we're operating in a frame where fairness isn't the relevant metric. The herald was very still. "Take these terms back to Admiral Sorvath," Vara said. "Tell him that I have terms of my own." "Majesty." "Tell him," she said, not unkindly, "that I am willing to negotiate a status of protected autonomy, with tribute structured around agricultural exchange rather than military subjugation. Tell him that I have certain assets beneath this citadel that the Dominion would find valuable as a partner and catastrophic as an enemy. Tell him that I know he needs a resupply point for the northeastern expansion, which has been stalled for 2 years because he has no reliable harbor on this coast." She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell him I am that harbor if he deals with me honestly. Tell him that if he does not deal with me honestly, I will make the Keth River look like a misunderstanding." She stood. The herald instinctively took a step back. "1 hour," she said. "I'll have tea sent to the courtyard." She walked out through the side passage without waiting for his response, and she did not let herself exhale until she was through the door and into the cool stone corridor beyond it, where Sira was waiting. "He'll carry the message," Sira said. "He will." Vara leaned against the wall for a moment. The child was moving again, that low, insistent flutter. She pressed her hand against it without thinking. "Get me Commandant Ose. I need to brief him on what we're actually doing, because the assets I mentioned don't yet exist in the form I described them." Sira stared at her. "You bluffed." "I implied. There's a distinction." She straightened and kept walking. "Mostly I bought time. Ose is clever. I need him in a room, and I need an hour, and I need someone to bring me something to eat because I haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, and the child apparently has opinions about that." What she had told the herald was not entirely fabrication. The vaults beneath the citadel did contain assets, specifically 4 years of Wren's careful, systematic work on the ancient thermal systems that honeycombed the bedrock beneath the promontory. He had been, before he was her husband and before he was her consort, and before he was the man who died at the Keth River holding a section of the eastern bank while the rest of the army retreated, an engineer of considerable skill. He had mapped the vents. He had calculated the pressures. He had written, in his small, precise handwriting in a journal she still kept beside her bed, a set of notes about what it would take to make those vents useful. Useful for what, he had not written explicitly. Wren had been cautious about putting certain thoughts on paper. But she knew what he'd been thinking. She'd been thinking the same thing at the same time, lying beside him in the dark during the brief peace 3 years ago, listening to the distant sound of the sea. There were nights when they had barely spoken at all, just lain in the dark together. both of them running the same calculations in their heads, both of them looking at the shape of the problem from different angles. And in the morning they would compare notes and find that they had independently arrived at the same place, which had always made him laugh. That particular startled laugh of someone encountering their own thought in someone else's mouth. She missed that laugh with a specificity she did not allow herself to dwell on. Ren had spent 4 years building toward the thermal plan, carefully, quietly, in the spaces between their other work, the border negotiations, the diplomatic missions, the grinding ordinary business of keeping a small kingdom alive and independent in the shadow of a large empire. He'd mapped the vents during the survey expeditions he'd led ostensibly to assess the harbor's capacity for expansion. He'd calculated pressures on long evenings when she'd thought he was going over the northern grain reports. He'd commissioned the early trigger mechanism under the guise of geothermal heating improvements for the lower citadel, which had the useful dual property of also genuinely working as geothermal heating improvements. He had been, in his particular way, impossible not to love. He had been practical about everything: food, sleep, logistics, the unglamorous mechanical underpinnings of survival. And then once in a while he would say something or do something that was so specifically, stubbornly, obviously human that she had to stop and simply look at him for a moment. This man who cared about grain reports and vent pressures, and also, profoundly and without irony, about the child they were going to have and the world that child would inhabit. He had died so the army could retreat. He had died at a river crossing, holding a position for 4 hours because there had been no one else and the position needed holding. She had read the battle report 6 times. She knew the exact sequence. She knew where he had been standing. She knew which river crossing. She had thought many times about going there, about standing on the eastern bank and looking at the water and doing whatever the thing was that people did when they went to places where people they loved had died. She had not gone. She had the citadel to run, a pregnancy to manage, an empire to hold off. She had filed it away for later, which was what she did with everything she could not afford to process in real time. She was accumulating quite a lot of things to process later. The Velthari Dominion was a military culture. It thought in terms of armies, fleets, force multipliers, supply lines. It was very good at absorbing those things and reflecting them back, amplified. You came at the Dominion with an army. The Dominion showed you a larger army. You came at them with a fleet. They showed you a larger fleet. You came at them with a geological event, though with the specific, unpredictable, unoutnumbered force of the Earth itself, and you were no longer fighting on terrain they understood. Commandant Ose arrived within 20 minutes. He was a short man, barrel-chested, with the deep brown skin and heavy brow ridges of the Western Orc clans, and he had one quality that Vara had come to value above almost all others in a military commander. He did not panic, and he did not dismiss ideas simply because they were unusual. She spread Ren's journals on the table. She explained what she was thinking. She watched him read, and she watched the moment when understanding shifted in his eyes from skepticism to calculation. "The timing would be the problem," he said. "Yes. If we trigger it while the fleet is still at anchor. They're not at anchor close enough to the vents. They'd need to enter the harbor." She pointed to the journal diagram. "Here. The pressure release point is here, beneath the harbor mouth. If the fleet enters, and Sorvath will want to enter, because from a military standpoint the promontory itself is the strategic prize, not the harbor. He'll position in the harbor to protect the landing." "Yes." Ose was quiet for a long moment, looking at the diagram. Then, "If we trigger it too early, we get a hot water column. Impressive, kill some sailors, doesn't stop the fleet. Too late, and the landing parties are already ashore. So it has to be exactly." "Exactly." Vara tapped the journal page. Ren calculated the trigger window as approximately 40 minutes from harbor mouth entry to full fleet deployment. If we release in the first 20 minutes, We catch the fleet before the landing parties are large enough to hold the beachhead. Ose looked at her. Did Ren build a trigger mechanism? He built a design for one. That's not the same as. No, she agreed. It's not, which is why I need you to spend the next 6 hours turning a design into a mechanism. You have 3 of Ren's engineers still in the garrison. Bring in the 2 geothermal specialists from the mining settlement. Give them everything from the journals. She held his gaze. I don't know if it can be done in 6 hours. It can't be done properly in 6 hours. Can it be done approximately? He thought about it. Approximately, he said slowly, is a very large word. I know. The risks to the Citadel itself. I know, she said again. He looked at her. He looked at her hands, one of which was resting, as it so often did now, against her abdomen. She did not move the hand. She did not use it as an argument or a plea. She simply did not hide it. You understand, he said, that Ren would have. Ren isn't here. Her voice was steady. Not hard, not armored, just steady, the way the floor of a forest is steady, the way things are when they've grown too deep to be moved easily by wind. I know what he would have said. I know what he would have wanted. I also know that he spent 4 years building this system because he believed in me, not because he believed in his own survival. She picked up the journal and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the small, precise handwriting she knew better than her own. This is what he built. I intend to use it. Ose nodded once. He picked up his own copy of the diagram. I'll need requisition authority for the vault teams. You have it. And someone needs to stall Sorvath, if he decides not to wait for my answer and moves the fleet. That's my job. She closed the journal. Go. She spent the next 3 hours doing the precise, painstaking, exhausting work of stalling a naval invasion through diplomacy. It was, she had always found, underrated as a military skill. She sent the herald back to Sorvath with a counter-proposal that was detailed enough to seem serious and structured in a way that required response rather than simple acceptance or rejection. She sent along a gift, 2 casks of the salted fish that the Velthari considered a delicacy, which told Sorvath that she knew his supply situation. And she sent along, folded into the gift basket with the casks, a personal note that addressed the admiral by his given name rather than his title. That was a gamble. It might read as disrespect or as intimacy, and the outcome depended entirely on whether Sorvath was the kind of military man who valued protocol above all, or the kind who valued being seen as an individual. She had studied his record. She was reasonably confident he was the second kind. While she waited for the reply, she actually sat down and ate a full meal, because Sira had placed food in front of her with an expression that made clear the consequences of refusing. And she briefed her remaining garrison commanders, and she sent evacuation orders quietly to the quarters of the citadel that were closest to the harbor-facing walls. She did not explain why. She said it was a precaution, and that the families of the garrison were to be moved to the deep interior rooms. The child moved 3 more times during the afternoon. She counted. Sorvath's reply arrived 2 hours before sunset. It was, as she had hoped, a counter proposal. He was engaged. He was treating this as a negotiation rather than a surrender ceremony. That meant the fleet would stay at anchor for at least another 12 hours while his people drafted language and considered terms. She sent back another reply that raised 3 new points, each of which was a reasonable concern, but each of which would require at least another exchange to resolve. She went to the vaults. The vaults ran 20 meters beneath the citadel floor, carved from the same dark basalt as the rest of the promontory's foundations. They smelled of sulfur and deep heat. The thermal engineers had set up their work on a long stone table that had once been used for something else entirely. She did not ask what, and Ren's journals were spread out alongside a set of rapidly produced mechanical drawings. Ose met her at the vault entrance. His expression was not reassuring. "Tell me," she said. "The trigger mechanism works. We've tested it on the northern vent, partial pressure. It releases cleanly. But the main release, the harbor mouth vent, the one that produces the effect you need, it's larger than Wren calculated. He was working from geological surveys that were incomplete." He showed her the new diagram. "The actual vent system under the harbor mouth feeds 3 times the volume he estimated. If we trigger it, we don't get a hot water column." She looked at the diagram. "We get what?" she said. "We get approximately what the Keth River got, but maritime," he pointed. "The harbor mouth will erupt. The initial thermal release will propagate along the seabed toward the anchor points. The displacement wave," he paused, "it will reach the promontory walls." She was quiet. "How much structural damage?" she asked. "Significant, the harbor-facing walls substantial, possibly the lower east wing." He looked at her. "We tested the northern vent at 1/3 pressure. The numbers scale, I'm not guessing." She looked at the diagram for a long time. "The deep interior rooms," she said. "Protected. The bedrock between the vault level and the interior rooms is thick enough. The evacuated families. Yes, they'd be safe. The garrison on the outer walls." A longer pause. "Partial exposure. The Eastern Wall team, partial exposure." She thought about the Eastern Wall team. She knew most of their names. She knew which ones had children, which ones had come to Wren's funeral and stood in the cold outside the hall because the hall was full and they didn't want to intrude, and she had gone out herself to stand with them because she couldn't bear the idea of them standing alone. "Is there a version," she said, "where we reduce the yield, control the release partially?" "Wren's design doesn't have fine-grained control. It's either triggered or not." "Could we build one?" She checked the angle of light through the vault's narrow windows. "In 8 hours." Osei was quiet for a moment. "Kayet," he said, meaning the younger of the 2 geothermal specialists, "says possibly. It would require," he gestured, "a complicated motion that encompassed several pages of engineering notes. It would require taking apart what we built and rebuilding it around a different pressure model." "Get Kayet," she said. Kayet was 26, small, with the perpetual slightly unfocused look of someone who spent most of their time thinking about things that weren't visually present. She had apprenticed under Wren for 2 years. She had, Vara knew, been in love with him in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that young apprentices sometimes were with the people who taught them to care about difficult things. Vara did not hold it against her. She found it, if anything, reassuring, another person who had understood what he was. "Can you build a partial release control?" Vara asked. Kayet chewed her lip. "Depends what you mean by control." "I mean the difference between a wave that swamps the fleet and a wave that also destroys the citadel walls. The harbor mouth vent would need a secondary baffle, something that redirects part of the outflow north, away from the promontory. It doesn't reduce the energy, it redirects the displacement." Kayet was already drawing something on the edge of a diagram, small and quick. "The problem is installation. The baffle has to go into the vent itself, 20 meters down, in a thermal vent." "Can it be done?" "In 8 hours, with the equipment we have." Kayet looked up. "I'd need to go down myself." "That's not what I asked." "No," Kayet said, "then maybe, if you let me try." Vara looked at her. The young engineer's face had that particular expression that she recognized from her own mirror, someone who was afraid, and had decided to do the thing anyway because the alternative was worse. "What do you need?" Vara said. The next 6 hours were among the strangest of Vara's life, and she had lived a life that already contained several candidates for the designation. She continued to negotiate with Sorvath's representatives, 3 more exchanges, each one raising and partially resolving issues, buying time in careful increments the way a surgeon manages blood loss. She ate again, because Sira stood over her until she did. She walked the interior corridors of the citadel and spoke with the soldiers there, not with the particular speeches of a commander on the eve of battle, but in the ordinary way of someone checking in, acknowledging people, carrying the specific weight of being seen by her, and seeing them in return. Several of them asked about the child. She told them the child was fine. The child was persistent. She had started to think of persistence as the child's defining characteristic, which she recognized as projection. She was projecting her own stubbornness onto an unborn child who could not yet form intentions. But she did it anyway because it helped, and because Ren had always said that the stories we tell about the people we love are also the stories we tell about ourselves. And whatever that child was going to be, she intended for the story to be one of persistence. 2 hours before midnight, Kayet emerged from the vault. She was scorched along one forearm and trembling slightly with the specific exhaustion of sustained concentration under physical stress. She had completed the baffle installation. She was not certain it would function as intended. She gave it, she said, a 60% chance of significant yield reduction. 40% chance it would fail to redirect and they'd get the full eruption. Is there a version, Vara asked, where it makes things worse? Kayet thought about it. No, the full eruption is the worst case either way. The baffle either improves it or doesn't change it. Then we proceed. The next 2 hours were among the strangest of Vara's life, and she had lived a life that already contained several candidates for the designation. She continued to negotiate with Sorvath's representatives. 3 more exchanges after Kayet's emergence from the vault, each one raising and partially resolving issues, buying time in careful increments the way a surgeon manages blood loss. The topics were real enough. The specifics of harbor access rights, the question of fishing territory, the complicated matter of how tribute was to be calculated in years of poor harvest. She wrote each reply herself, at the large table in the strategy room by candlelight, with Sira sitting across from her, and occasionally handing her tea she forgot to drink. There was a particular quality to work done under these circumstances, with the knowledge that everything you were writing served 2 purposes simultaneously, the stated one and the real one. She had been doing this kind of work for most of her adult life. Negotiations where the apparent subject was not the actual subject. Conversations with 2 layers, the surface layer and the one underneath. She had become very good at it. She had become good at it because she'd had to, because small kingdoms that wanted to survive in the orbit of large empires had no alternative. She thought about her daughter, and she did think of the child as her daughter, though she had no way to know. She had simply decided, in the same deliberate way she decided most things, that this was a daughter, and she was going to proceed on that basis until proven otherwise. She thought about what she would tell this daughter eventually about these hours. What she would say about the strange calm of sitting at a table writing diplomatic correspondence, while the geological trap her husband had spent 4 years building was 20 meters beneath her feet, and an imperial fleet sat at anchor in the harbor. She thought she would probably tell the truth. She thought she would say, "You do the work in front of you. You do the thing you can do, and you do it well, and you do not let the weight of the larger thing crush the smaller thing that still requires doing right now." She sent a final message to Sorvath at midnight. It was not a continuation of the negotiation. It was a direct message, to him personally, in the informal register she had established over the course of the exchanges. She thanked him for his good faith. She said she hoped they could reach an agreement in the morning, because she had found the conversation productive. She mentioned, obliquely, that she was tired and going to rest. She was not going to rest. She was going to the outer wall to give the order. She stood on the eastern wall at the 2-hour mark before dawn, when the sky was the deep blue-black of the last hour before the moon set, and the sea was a flat darkness punctuated by the lights of Sorvath's fleet. 40 ships, 8,000 soldiers, asleep or keeping watch, none of them expecting what was coming because nothing in their experience as a military force had prepared them to expect it. She had brought Ren's journal. She didn't know exactly why. It wasn't useful. It wasn't going to tell her anything she didn't already know. But she'd taken it from the bedside table where it lived and carried it up to the wall under her arm, and she held it now, the worn leather cover soft under her fingers, the weight of it familiar. Ren had carried it everywhere. She had teased him about it. He'd said, "I carry it because I'm always going to want to write something down, and the moment I don't have it is the moment the thought I most need to remember will occur to me." She had said, "What if you're in a situation where you can't write?" He had said, "Then I'll be very frustrated." He would have been frustrated on the eastern bank of the Keth River. He had not had the journal with him. She had found it on the bed when she returned from the council session that morning, lying open to his last entry, which was about the baffle design, which was about thermal pressure differentials and flow rates and the specific geometry of the harbor mouth. He had been thinking, right up until he left, about the problem, about how to solve it. She had closed the journal and put it on the bedside table and gone to run a war. Osei stood beside her now. Sira stood on her other side. Below, the garrison soldiers who had been positioned on the outer walls had been quietly pulled back to the inner wall line over the previous 3 hours. The outer wall was largely empty. "When the fleet begins to move," she said, "not before." Osei nodded. "If they don't move, then we don't trigger it and we negotiate in the morning." He paused, and hope Sorvath's good faith is real. She looked at the fleet lights. She thought about Sorvath, who she had never met, who had built a career in the service of an empire that expanded by consuming smaller things, and who was, by the account she'd read, not a cruel man by the Dominion standards. She thought about what she was about to do to 40 ships and the people on them, and she let herself feel the weight of it without flinching from it, because she had made her peace long ago with the fact that some of the most necessary things were also the worst things, and that the worst thing was not to pretend otherwise. She thought about Ren. She thought about a child who had not been born yet. She thought about 14 kingdoms in 60 years, absorbed and made Velthari, their languages becoming dialects and then accents, and then archaic curiosities preserved in libraries that nobody read. She thought about what it meant to be the last speaker of a language. She thought about what it meant for a child to grow up in the court of the people who had destroyed her kingdom, speaking their language, eating their food, praying to their gods, and slowly, over years, forgetting the sound of her mother's voice in her mother's tongue. She thought, not this one. The fleet began to move an hour before dawn. She watched the lights shift as the ships raised anchor, the slow, orderly movement of a naval force that had done this many times and knew its choreography. They came toward the harbor mouth in the formation she'd predicted. The larger warships first, to establish the harbor perimeter, the troop transports behind. "Now," she said. Osei said, into the communication line that ran down through the citadel to the vault. "Trigger." For a moment, nothing. Then the harbor mouth lit up. It was not an explosion in the way that the word usually implies, not a bang and a flash and a cloud of debris. It was a release, the way a clenched thing releases, a column of superheated water and steam that rose from the harbor mouth with a sound like the world clearing its throat, and then spread outward in a wave that moved with an authority that was purely geological, purely indifferent, purely the consequence of pressures that had been building in the bedrock for 10,000 years. The displacement wave hit the fleet. Vara watched. She had made herself watch. She did not look away. The warships at the harbor entrance were struck broadside. Several capsized. The others farther back, caught by the outer edge of the wave, were driven off their courses, striking each other in the chaos of the surge. The troop transports behind them, which had not yet entered the harbor mouth, were hit by the secondary wash. In the torchlight and the rising steam, she could see the silhouettes of masts falling, of hulls riding up on the wave and coming down wrong. She heard the sound of it arrive a second after she saw it, the complex roar of water and breaking wood and human voices. Kayet's baffle held. The displacement wave struck the promontory's harbor walls, the outer harbor walls, the old stone that had taken 100 years to build but struck them glancingly rather than directly. Vara felt it in the soles of her feet, a deep vibration, the citadel shuddering once and then holding. Dust fell from the ceiling of the wall gallery. A stone somewhere below cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The east wing, she would learn later, had lost its lowest level. The harbor-facing outer wall had significant structural damage. It would need, the engineers would estimate, 2 years of repair. The fleet needed considerably more than repair. In the gray light before dawn, the harbor was chaos. Perhaps a third of the ships were still intact and functional. The rest were in varying states of distress, some sinking, some disabled, some simply adrift. The landing parties that had been forming on the troop transports had not disembarked. The coordinated naval assault that Sorvath had planned had become, in 3 minutes, a rescue operation. Vara sent a herald to the fleet at sunrise. The message was brief. She offered to send her own small harbor vessels to assist with rescue operations. She offered to negotiate in good faith the question of survivor care and the disposition of the damaged ships. She offered, again, the protected autonomy arrangement she had described the previous afternoon. She did not gloat. She did not make any reference to what had just happened, beyond acknowledging that circumstances had changed and that she hoped they could now speak plainly. Sorvath's reply came 2 hours later. He requested a direct meeting. He did not request it from a position of force. She met him on the harbor pier, the small working pier on the north side, which the wave had not reached. She came in full armor, with Sira at her shoulder and Ose behind her. She came with no more than that, because she wanted Sorvath to understand that she was not coming as someone who had just survived an attack and was now cautiously emerging. She was coming as someone who had been here the whole time, who would be here after he left, who was, in the most essential sense, not going anywhere. Sorvath was older than she had expected, 60 perhaps, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades at sea. He had come with 2 aides and a flag officer, a compact, careful escort that said, "I am not treating this as a surrender, but I am also not walking into an ambush." She noticed that he had changed clothes. He was in clean uniform, the Velthari Admiral's formal gray, though she could see at the collar the salt stains that thorough washing hadn't fully removed. He had made himself as presentable as circumstances allowed. She filed that away. He looked at the harbor, at the wreckage and the rescue vessels and the floating debris, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite what she'd expected. It was not rage. It was not wounded pride. It was, she thought, a kind of recognition. The look of a man encountering something he had been told could not exist and is now being required to update his understanding of the world. "The geological feature beneath the harbor," he said, without preamble. "Your consort's work." "Yes." "He was at the Keth River." "Yes." Sorvath was quiet for a moment. Then, "I read the reports. I thought Dreven's account of what happened there was exaggerated. Officers exaggerate to explain defeats." "It wasn't exaggerated." He nodded slowly. He looked at her face, at her armor, at her hand which had drifted, without her quite intending it, to her abdomen again. He looked at that for a moment, and she could not quite read his expression. "The child," he said. "Is mine," she said, and her voice was entirely even, "and will remain so." Another silence. The harbor was still chaotic behind him, voices calling across the water, the creak of stressed timber, the lap of waves against displaced hulls. A rescue vessel passed behind him pulling a net, and she could see the dark shapes of men in the water being hauled toward it. Her harbor workers, her sailors, working in the wreckage of the thing she had done, because she had told them to help and they had said yes, because they were her people and they understood without being told explicitly that this was what they were. The Dominion doesn't negotiate protected autonomy, he said, as a rule. You've been making exceptions to your rules for 60 years, she said. You absorbed the Kethani principalities without a military campaign because their council offered favorable trade terms. You gave the Sorvani coast semi-autonomous status because their fishing fleets were more valuable intact than dismantled. You have never once operated the way your doctrine says you operate when operating differently was more profitable. He looked at her with an expression she could only describe as assessment, the look of someone recalibrating. You've studied our records, he said. My husband spent 4 years building a system to destroy your fleet, she said. I spent 4 years building a system to understand the people commanding it. We each worked with what we were best at. She paused. He was the better engineer. I like to think the intelligence work was more evenly matched. Sorvath looked at the harbor again. The morning light was strengthening, burning off the last of the pre-dawn murk, and the harbor was coming fully visible now in its extent. Broken masts, listing hulls. The dark shapes of rescue vessels moving like water beetles between the wreckage. A third of his fleet, perhaps, was usable. The rest was salvage or debris. He had come here with 40 ships and 8,000 soldiers, and the intention of conducting a routine annexation. He was leaving with a harbor full of wreckage and a counterpart who had just demonstrated, calmly and without apparent anger, that she could destroy an imperial fleet with the geology beneath her feet. I have, he said, approximately 2,000 soldiers and sailors in the water or on damaged ships. Some of them are injured. Some of them will not survive without medical attention. I know. Your offer of harbor vessels is real, she said, unconditional. Whatever we do or don't agree here, those people are in the water and they need help and we will help them. She met his eyes. I'm not offering it as leverage. I'm offering it because they are people in the water. He held her gaze for a long time. You are, he said finally, extremely inconvenient. I have been told this before. He almost smiled at that. A slight shift, quickly suppressed, the expression of a man who had decided to maintain formality but found it briefly difficult. The protected autonomy arrangement, the terms you proposed yesterday. Still on the table. The tribute structure, agricultural exchange. With a harbor provisioning agreement for the northeastern expansion. Which, if my understanding of the Dominion's current strategic position is accurate, is the thing you actually need from this coast. And your sovereignty. My sovereignty, my child's lineage, my language, my laws, my succession. He was quiet. Across the harbor, a rescue vessel bumped against the hull of a listing warship, and voices called across the water in the Velthari language, the standard negotiating language of the Dominion, which she spoke fluently, asking who needed help and who could swim. There will be factions, Sorvath said, in the Dominion Council who will require. Show them the harbor, she said. Show them what happened to 40 ships and 8,000 soldiers. Tell them that this is the cost of doing business the old way, and ask them whether the new way, a harbor, a provisioning point, a loyal tributary who has demonstrated both her capabilities and her restraint, is preferable. He looked at her. Restraint, he repeated. I could have triggered it while the fleet was closer to the promontory, she said quietly. While the harbor was full, the damage would have been total. I chose the timing I chose because I wanted to stop the invasion, not destroy the army. The people in the water, most of them will survive. The ships can be salvaged or replaced. She held his gaze. I want an agreement. I have wanted an agreement since before your fleet left Velthari harbor. An agreement is worth more to me than a victory. This is not me being merciful. This is me being clear about my actual interests. The sun was fully up now, burning the harbor fog off in wisps and layers, and the water was coming visible in its full extent, the listing ships, the bobbing debris, the small harbor vessels moving among the wreckage with ropes and nets, and the specific purpose of people doing a difficult thing because it was necessary. Her soldiers, her harbor workers, her people, out in the morning light, fishing Velthari soldiers out of the water. Sorvath watched them for a long moment. There was something in his face that she had not expected, not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition, perhaps, of what it meant to be fished out of cold water by the people whose harbor you had arrived to take. The particular human weight of owing your life to someone you had come to dispossess. 40 years ago, he said, when I was 20 and new to the Navy, I asked my commanding admiral what the Dominion actually wanted. What the point was, he said, stability. He said the Dominion didn't want to rule every kingdom. It wanted every kingdom to be predictable, safe to trade with, unlikely to become a threat. He glanced at her. You are not predictable. No. But you are, he said slowly, extremely unlikely to become a threat. I am, she said, extremely capable of being one, which is different. He nodded. He looked at the harbor one last time. I'll need to communicate with the council, he said. I'll need 3 days. You have 3 days, she paused. Your injured sailors can be housed in the Citadel's lower halls. Neutral ground. My physicians will treat them. No conditions. He looked at her. He seemed to be working through some internal process, something she couldn't quite read. She waited, because waiting was something she was very good at. Your consort, he said, Keth River. He died holding the eastern bank. Yes. How long? 4 hours, until the retreat was complete. Sorvath was quiet for a moment. Then, he was a soldier. He was an engineer. He picked up a sword because there was nobody left who knew how to hold the line. She kept her voice even. It was a practiced evenness now, not armor so much as a habit of steadiness that had become genuinely part of her. He was very good at learning things quickly. Clearly, Sorvath said. Then, after a pause that held something she couldn't quite name, the child, boy or girl. I don't know yet. Do you? He stopped, started again. Do you have a preference? She thought about it. She thought about Ren, who had spent hours on this question, who had argued with himself about it out loud in the way he did when he was genuinely uncertain, going back and forth between reasons, weighing them, discarding and retrieving them. She thought about what he had finally said, lying beside her on a night when the stars were particularly clear, and the sea had that particular flat silver quality that meant the weather was about to change. He had said, I just want them to be stubborn. I want them to be so stubborn that the world can't do anything with them except accommodate them. No preference, she said, just stubborn. Sorvath looked at her for a long moment. Then he put out his hand, the Velthari gesture of provisional agreement, wrist to wrist rather than palm to palm, which meant I am not yet fully committed, but I am genuinely considering it, which was, in the Dominion's diplomatic lexicon, the most honest thing an admiral could offer. She met it wrist to wrist, provisional but real. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. She walked back along the pier as the morning light spread across the ruined harbor, across the rescue vessels and the listing ships and the long work of pulling broken things back toward something whole. Sira fell into step beside her, Ose behind. Well, Sira said very quietly. He'll recommend the agreement to the council, Vara said. He's not certain they'll accept it, but he'll recommend it. And if they don't? Vara looked at the harbor, at the wreckage, at the morning. She thought about 3 days from now and the message that would come and what it would say or not say. She thought about the engineering work that would need to be done, the outer walls, the east wing, Kayet's next assignment, the long, careful reconstruction of a harbor that was also a trap and also a home. She thought about the long work of being a small kingdom that intended to persist. Then we rebuild the baffle, she said, and we start working on the northern vent. Sierra was quiet for a moment. Then, Kate will be pleased. Kate is going to be the head of the engineering corps, Vara said. She just doesn't know it yet. She put her hand once more against the swell of her abdomen. The child was still. Not gone, she could feel the weight of it, the warmth, but still, as if resting. As if, having spent the night asserting its presence, it was now content to simply be. She thought, you're going to be born into a kingdom that stood. She thought, whatever else I give you that. The sun came fully over the eastern ridge and fell on the harbor in long gold bars, and she walked in it, step by step, toward the gate of her citadel, which was hers, which would remain hers, which had survived what it had needed to survive and now had the harder, longer, more necessary work of the morning ahead. There would be so much to do. The walls, the engineering reports, the 3 days of waiting for Sorvath's reply, and then whatever came after that, the negotiation in earnest, the careful drafting of terms, the long, careful work of turning a provisional wrist-to-wrist into something written and binding and real. There would be the child in 4 months and everything that came with that. There would be the rebuilding. There would be the thing she had not let herself think about yet, the thing she kept filed in the room she was living in, going, eventually, to a river crossing and standing on an eastern bank and doing the thing that needed doing there, finding out what it felt like to stand in the place where someone you loved had decided to stay. Not yet, not today. Today there was the morning, and the gate and the work. She was very tired. She was also, in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome of the night and everything to do with the specific quality of a clear morning, after a thing you had decided and done and not flinched from, entirely herself. She went in. The gate closed behind her. The harbor was alive with voices and motion, the work of recovery, the work of salvage, the work of deciding what comes next, which was, when she considered it, the work of being alive in a world that would always require more of you than you had been told it would, and of doing it anyway, because the alternative was to let the world be shaped by people who did not care enough to refuse. She had always cared enough to refuse. The child moved again once as she crossed the threshold, a small certain flutter, insistent and persisting. She pressed her hand against it. She kept walking. Somewhere in the harbor, a rescue vessel's bell rang twice, the harbor signal for all survivors accounted for on a section of wreckage. Someone raised a shout in answer. She heard it through the stone walls, muffled and human and alive. She kept walking. The day had begun.